Hello, I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to LCRL's Live Liberty Alert. We're gathering again here on Wednesday to talk about the issues of the day from a two-kingdom perspective. Our goal is to we're advocating in D.C. for our churches, our schools, and our universities. We're there to talk about religious liberty. We're talking about the sanctity of life, the institution of marriage, and educational freedom for the sake of our mission. But part of our goal is to also be at work with you so that we can grow in our ability to be two kingdom citizens who are useful to God in being a part of the culture, engaging the culture for the sake of the culture, as well as for the sake of the mission of the church. So it's great to be here with you today. I don't know how you're all doing in this self-quarantine. I could use a good haircut. My hair I don't know what it's like, but there's a sense where our faith still gives us the joy that we have. And of course, our faith is a yearning for us to be able to get out there again, live lives of freedom and service to others in Christ's name. I do want to say thank you to a lot of you who are sending me questions. I'm going to incorporate a lot of those questions today. Today, we're going to talk about through the crisis, and we're going to use another two kingdom principle to help us answer some of the questions that are out there. And the title for today is Vocational Respect, Seeking the Truth. And you can see the tension in that. And again, two kingdoms, there's always a tension in two kingdoms because two kingdoms realizes that God is at work in the world two different ways. And if you don't understand that these are two radically different ways, he works through the law, but the law doesn't save. The law can curb unrighteousness. The law can prevent things from becoming totally uncivil or totally unjust, but it's never going to change the human heart. So law, gospel, God's preserving work, even through vocations of non-believers as well as believers, but his saving work through Christ alone for the sake of all. There are two radically different ways. And so we're going to unpack that today because in vocational respect, what we're saying is God can work to preserve the world through good moms and dads, even if they're not believers. Now, that's not going to save the world, but it can provide a civility to our culture that can actually allow us to proclaim the gospel freely so people might know Christ. And so again, we want to talk about that today as well. I do want to, and then also vocational respect, so submit to the authorities. Well, if God is at work through these authorities, what happens if they transgress their power or they step out of the vocational boundaries? And that's where seeking the truth comes in. And the American experiment actually helps us define the boundaries of the magistrates in a much clearer way than other cultures do. So we're enhanced in our ability to be good citizens in America for the sake of the culture and the church, and we'll unpack that today too. I'd like to start off with Cheryl asked a question, and I love this. I want to start with this because I do think we need to have a sense of where we are with a lot of the issues of our day today. And let me see if I think I unfortunately put the answer. Well, let me see if I can. Okay, let me see if we can find that. She was talking about the government. The comment that she's receiving a lot is, never in my lifetime have I experienced something like this. And she was talking about, having a perspective about that. And what a great thing to start our discussion on today, because exactly, we're talking about the issue where it could be 100,000 lives are lost and the kinds of things that we're up against. And a friend of mine was talking about how we need perspective today. Tom Moyer posted something on his Facebook post, and he talked about if you were born in the year 1900, the kinds of things that you experienced through time. And I'm going to do this off the top of my head because I don't have it in front of me. But he said if you're born in 1900, your high school days you dealt with World War I, and when you got through with that, and I guess there was millions and millions of people died in World War I think 25 million. Then you had the first flu pandemic, if you will, that killed millions of people. and that's when you're 18, and then you went through the Great Depression towards your late 20s. Then right in the middle of your prime years, you were in the Depression, and then World War II, and 50 million people died in the middle of that. Then came the Korean War, 5 million people. Then the Vietnam War, and all these different things that happened. And the Vietnam War was 20 years long, and so by the time you were in your 80s, you had experienced all these kinds of things. And then he points out that, can you imagine a teenager coming to their 85-year-old grandmother or grandfather and saying, gosh, you really don't know what it's like to be a kid today. It's tough. And thinking of all the things that they lived through from 1900 to 1985, 1990, 1995. Wow. What it did for me when that hit me, it gave me perspective again of the things we're struggling with. And everything you struggle with. I mean, even getting sick where you realize your mortality, that's an existential issue. I'm not dismissing that at all. But it was amazing to me because I think about my grandparents, and my grandparents, incredibly, as they lived through those times, the one thing that defines my grandparents is they had a joy about them in the midst of, they didn't they weren't wealthy by any means. But they had a joy about them, and they loved being in church. And sociologically, they said in those difficult times, 70% of our population went to church. And that's changed dramatically. And so again, that loss of the sense of purpose, that loss of the sense of the divine, that loss of the sense of our spiritual dimension and all these things is part of the problem why we overestimate our abilities and overestimate our struggles, and we tend to be less helpful to one another, and we sure get distance from God in the middle of that too. So something to keep in mind as we talk about vocational respect, seeking the truth, it's because God is at work. And God is at work two different ways, to preserve and to save. All right, again, the reopening guidelines, you keep those in mind. I'm not going to go through those again, but again, as we start to reopen, as we move through this crisis, what's really interesting is the goalposts are changing a little bit in how our politicians talk about this. And I'm not going to get into the debate of why that's happening, but there are some people who are starting to use these kinds of things to their advantage. What we really do need to understand is that we're free people, and free people will do the right thing for others based on the kinds of issues and challenges that are before us. And last week we talked about the fact that we're facing two crises right now. We're facing the crisis of the pandemic, but we're also facing an even greater crisis of just the unraveling of our culture, our economy, and what that will do to our people long term. The quarantine can be over and you may be able to go back outside, but once the economy is destroyed, you may not be able to ramp that thing back up as quickly. And most of us have never experienced anything like the Great Depression. We've never experienced empty shelves. We just think if you want food, you go to the grocery store. I was told yesterday that Sam's is running out of, I think that they're running out of chicken. There was no chicken in Sam's Clubs yesterday. And I was also told, I think you've read this, that Wendy's has run out of the beef. We can talk about why that's happening, but again, if you start to destroy businesses and destroy people's capacity to work for themselves, you can't replace that by sitting at home. And the other thing is, we don't want people waiting for other people to take care of their basic needs when God gives us the ability to do that. And then He wants us to take care of our needs so that we can actually care for one another. So again, practice, the good hygiene things that we've talked about before. But here's the key. Why did we lock down all people when we now know that there's vulnerable people to this virus that we need to protect and need to care for? In fact, I read a quote, and I've been reading on this stuff every day in preparation for the stuff we do. But what I'm told is that 50% of those who have died from this have been in the homes, the retirement homes. Well, why aren't we doing something unique there to protect them? In fact, one state was actually sending COVID people who had the COVID virus back into the homes. And that was the most vulnerable population of all. Why didn't we have unique things there? I looked at the 5 states that have actually suffered the most. And I think 3 or 4 of the states have mass transit. And they had mass transit running in February and I think maybe even up to March. where people were just shoved into the trains and stuff like that. And of course, that could have been a big problem with the spread of the virus in those places, those urban areas. My point is, one size does not fit all, and as people are moving out, why did we lock the whole country down for the sake of these things? It's worth thinking about, especially as we move forward. Okay, we did what we had to do when we didn't really know what was going on. Now we have more and more information, more and more knowledge, but we also know free people need to get back to living free lives to serve other people for the sake of our culture. So today we want to look at the week in review, what's going on with religious liberty and the reopening of America. We're going to look at that. How do we keep this in balance? One of the questions that a couple of you asked was, how do we keep this in balance about submit to the authorities, which the Bible teaches in Romans 13, and then, civil disobedience when they overreach. I don't like that word civil disobedience, because even civil disobedience for the Christian is Christian obedience. And even if you're treated unjustly, it doesn't mean you have to act a certain way. The goal is to always try to find the best thing to do for the sake of the culture and for the sake of the church, to be faithful to God. That's how the Christian thinks about it. And to me, that's not civil disobedience, that's obedience. And our founding fathers actually said it very clearly that if there was civil law that didn't align itself with biblical law and natural law, then this was an unjust law. And I know that a lot of people wouldn't put those together today. People do believe that we've somehow circumvented natural law and biblical law. No, you can't create a new law any more than you can create a new fundamental color in nature. God has wired us a certain way. There's a conscience that's in each one of us. And so again, I think we have a right to get out there and mix it up, talking about the moral principles that we think they're not salvific, they're not going to save us, but they can actually civilize us, make us humane, and give us that kind of community that allows us to live with each other, even when we might disagree. And then how does this principle of vocational respect, seeking the truth, how does it help us answer the questions that are now being forced on us? Like, I keep hearing people going, either way. Well, stay home saves lives. Not necessarily, because it could actually create a bigger problem over here that destroys lives. Well, going back to work saves lives. Well, it does put people at risk. Remember last week we talked about the fact that Two Kingdoms understands that in a broken world you can have two wrong perspectives or two wrong actions, but one is less wrong than the other. I know that sounds crazy, but again, in a broken world, sometimes you might get into that situation. Well, if we destroy the economy, that's wrong. If we put people at risk from this pandemic, that's wrong. But now we're at a point where we've got two wrongs, and we've got to actually start to balance those things and move forward. Again, we want to talk about vocational respect, seeking the truth will help us move forward in that regard as Christian citizens who are useful in God's hands for the sake of our culture and the sake of the church. So, things are opening up. That's good news, I think. And I think that should be celebrated. I think we've seen some good things happening. Again, when you talk about things opening up, sanctified common sense, folks, you can listen and get the information on a lot of these things, just like you can find this stuff, and then you can start to put these things together. What's the right way to move forward? What's really strange to me, and I don't know if you've been out there, but I go out maybe once a week, maybe to get some groceries or stuff like that, and doing some things around the house that I need done. And I'm noticing that at the end of this kind of quarantine, people are more fearful out there, not less. I really have a problem with whether it's a politician or whether it's a news, people trying to keep us afraid. I have a real problem with that. Yeah, we need to face whatever the challenge of this is, but not out of fear. We have to face it with knowledge. We have to face it with sanctified common sense. We have to face it with courage. We have to face it with a love for our neighbor, but we don't want to face it out of fear. And people are literally being scared to death in our country. And I don't think that the data warrants that. That's my opinion, but I don't think the data warrants it. And so use your sanctified common sense. Understand that we're in a lesser of two evils situation. So this hyperbole stuff about, blood on one's hands and you're murdering people. You've got to, folks, we got to put that back in its place. That doesn't help anything. It doesn't help anything. And if you have people screaming at one another because they have this kind of like a secular puritanism, as if they actually know that if you go outside, you are physically going to kill somebody. They don't know that. And so there's all kinds of ramifications to opening the place up or keeping it completely shut down. And we need to actually move forward with some common sense and some wisdom and love for our neighbors. So, if you see somebody who's afraid of, that distancing thing, try to be, you honor their space the best that you can. And you move forward and you wear the mask and you do all those things until we kind of get past some of this stuff. But man, oh man, we've got to actually, lesser of two evils means we don't really know the correct answer to all of this stuff because we're in a broken world and it's been unleashed a bit. No hysteria. No hysteria. What we need is calm, sanctified common sense, courageous voices. And that's where I think the church can be a real blessing. We're going to talk about some things that, what should the church be doing as it moves out into the community? And I mean the church as a whole. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But, you church leaders, pastors, I know you're doing great stuff already. So I don't want to give you like a prescription for what to do. But I want to tell you that when we protect your liberty, we're protecting your liberty so you can be creative in how you serve one another. So there's some good things going on out there. Bill Barr, I think he's doing a great job with the Department of Justice. I just read something where he again is issuing some rulings on some of the stuff because he sees some abuses happening, especially what was happening in Virginia. Ralph Northam, the governor, locked down. Basically said if you have more than 10 people in church, it's punishable by a year in jail or a $2,500 fine. What was interesting again about this is when he was conducting his briefings, he had more than 20 people in the room. So he's already violating the very order he's demanding of the church. And there were some churches that got caught in this, and so those churches actually, basically pushed back in a civil way. And it said, they were observing that the church actually saw 21 people at his press briefing. They saw 268 cars in the Walmart parking lot, and Virginia's state-run liquor stores were open, and they had their best march on record. So again, the point was you cannot make laws particular to the church that you don't expect for everybody else. And since the church is an essential, and maybe that's again going to be the challenge, the church is an essential structure in our society. Now, for those of you who think that that's kind of going away, I hear all this talk about the Constitution was written by folks way back when, and now we need kind of new views on this. Actually, the Constitution codified thousands of years of thoughts about humanity, about law, about state, about tyranny, all these different things, and they're fundamental. Human beings are fundamentally broken. And so the separation of powers is not something that's going to go away, because if it goes away, tyranny will come. And your inherent rights as an individual, as a citizen, they flow from the notion that you're created in the image of God. And the Founding Fathers said, even if they all weren't the Orthodox Christians that we tend to think that they should have been, they had a sense of higher authority, and that higher authority was God, not the state. In fact, the state, if it became the higher authority, that's what led to tyranny. And so when you look at their writings and stuff like that, it's incredibly powerful to see this. And so, when a person like the governor can shut down the church as if he has that right, but he can keep open other things that he just decides are more palatable to his worldview, he doesn't have that right in his vocation. And the DOJ is acting like a good referee and saying, you're a government official, government officials are the referees, they get to live life, they get to play in the game. Again, remember I told you about that writing called, it's terrible when the refs play the game. You should read that, because that's what the view of what a healthy government is supposed to do in the American constitutional situation. This is happening all over the place. It's happening in Kansas. It's happening in Massachusetts again, where pastors are being served notices if they're serving, even if they're meeting all the social distancing guidelines, even if they're doing worship in such a way where they're bringing in 10 people at a time, where their people are sitting 6 feet apart with the masks on and all that. Overzealous magistrates are locking them down, and they're fining them, and it's really kind of getting to the point of absurdity in a couple of places. I'm not even going to get into what's going on in Michigan, because that's even beyond religious liberty. There's civil liberty issues that are going on there, and it's amazing to hear a governor say, "I have the right to do whatever I want," even when their legislature is saying, "No, you don't." And yet these are the same people that often talk about the First Amendment, and they talk about how they have First Amendment protections and these kinds of things. So isn't it interesting that those same people are the ones that are saying, "I'm going to lock you down," even if it causes you to go out of business? So that's where we're at with a lot of those kind of things. My interest is ultimately with the church. You have to make up your own mind about what you're doing as a citizen, but we'll talk about how you can do that in a healthy way too at the end of this discussion today. There are some religious liberty issues that are going on out there, because there's government mischief going on too. You finally have to decide what's going on with some of these politicians, but politicians by definition are part of a power structure, and the government will always want to be more powerful. And the constitutional protections of our culture were to limit the government so that you could be free, and freedom then to live virtuous, self-disciplined lives for the sake of those you love. That's really the vision of America, and it's a republic view of America. And like Ben Franklin said, we're a republic if you can keep it. Okay. All right. So the religious liberty issues that are out there, we talked about the DOJ, the Department of Justice, kind of issuing warnings to officials who are overstepping their boundaries. That to me is a healthy view of the federal government doing its job for the sake of the individual liberties of people in the states. Again, we talked about, we're seeing some good refereeing going on there, although we're starting to see some politicians who are playing the game. I think one of the things that's amazing to me is you get all these PSAs and politicians saying, "Don't do this and do that." And then we're seeing egregious acts where they actually go do the one thing they told you not to do. And that really is a problem. When you have a government that says, "I'm going to make you do this, but we don't have to," that's the wrong spirit of government. I think I saw that with one of the mayors who gave lockdown orders, said, "Don't leave your house," but then he was out walking without a mask, walking his dog out in the park. I saw another politician who got her hair coiffed and taken care of. One other politician went to his gym, with all of his people. And you're sitting there going, "Wait a minute, we can't do any of that stuff. How come you can?" And that is a real issue. The 28th Amendment, and I see this on the Hill a lot. There's a lot of laws that Congress passes. Somehow they don't have to abide by those things. And that's a real problem, because if they pass laws, they have to live under the same laws we do. And when somehow that starts giving way, then there's an elitism, and the whole idea of the citizen government is kind of lost. And that's where we are with some of these things. The other thing that was happening this last week, again, the cultural issues. The abortion as an essential thing. Imagine the argument that's going on here, that abortion itself is an essential thing. I also saw that Planned Parenthood won some kind of judgment against the people who filmed them. And what they basically had is people who filmed them selling baby parts on the kind of like on a black market. Folks, okay, whether they should have been filmed or not, there should be outcry of people harvesting baby parts for the sake of industry. And that's what was going on. There was no outcry about that. And Planned Parenthood somehow got a judge to issue a ruling against the people who got them on tape saying these things. Well, that's crazy. And when you have states that are letting children be born even past the 9th month, but if they were to be aborted, they can be killed, and you're calling that an essential element of the lockdown, but you're saying churches are not essential? that's a scary thing. And I think we need to kind of find a way to push back on the sanctity of life, the inherent sanctity of life, and all those things, especially now, because the last thing we want is a utilitarian view of life. If the government grants you rights, then suddenly the rights you have can be taken away too, and now we can actually dispose of children, or we can dispose of sick people on the other end of the spectrum. You don't want a society like that. And that's where a lot of the secular societies of last century, whether it's Nazism, whether it's Mao, whether it's Mussolini, or all those things, those were secular communist societies where the state became the ultimate thing. And look at some of the things they did to their own people. We don't want that here. Okay? And then the attacks on marriage and family continue. I've got an article coming out on one of the Fridays here where it's going to talk about how marriage is an essential thing moving forward. We need to actually realize that without marriage, you're left to the whims of society and the whims of the state. Honor your father and your mother because father, mother, child, that is the trinity of civility, if you want to use that terminology. That's God's atom, if you will, of a healthy organism called society. Even the Greeks, who didn't have a Christian worldview, understood that if you didn't have a healthy, virtuous populace, especially with their families, you couldn't have a healthy city or a healthy state. And so again, we need to kind of get involved in those discussions about marriage for the sake of our culture, not just for the sake of our teaching for one another. So that's what's been going on. But what we have seen is, there's still growing overreach, and we want to push back on that because, again, we want the church to be free, to be the church, for the sake of its community and for the sake of those that we serve. So government dishonoring the guidelines, that's one of the first things when you start to realize the uniqueness of the American experiment is that the give to Caesar discussion in the Bible is uniquely contextualized in America because Caesar's not at the top in America, Caesar's at the bottom. Okay? And so And that Caesar role, if you will, is very limited because the founding fathers believed that free individuals seeking virtuous happiness with self-disciplined lives motivated by their faith and religion, that was the key to liberty and to entrepreneurship and all the different things that we've actually experienced in our culture. So we live in a culture where Caesar is a contractual relationship. We have a role to play in defining that limitation going forward. It's not a regal relationship. I was trying to come up with the opposite of regal, and really it's unheroic. When you look to your government as the hero, you've got it all upside down. Your heroes should be mom and dad. Your heroes should be your leaders in your church communities or your leaders in your communities, those who are close to home, those you work with every day, those you actually have a relationship with. Your heroes start there. The minute you are yearning for a hero, it kind of reminds me of the Old Testament when the children of Israel wanted a king. And that God said, you get a king, he's going to impose taxes, he's going to impose law. You're going to miss the whole point of what I wanted you to be as my people in this world. So again, America tended to contextualize that in a constitutional way of organizing our culture, and that's contractual, not regal. Again, we got to fight back on this targeting of the church as non-essential, and we've got to actually challenge some of these guidelines when there's no clear reason for these things, and it's becoming more apparent that the data that is being used behind this is a bit sketchy with some of the kinds of things that are being put forth. And again, this is an economic, sociological, and spiritual challenge as well. So today, vocational respect. That's Romans 13. That's the fourth commandment. Honor your father and your mother. Submit to the authorities. That's vocational respect. And I always say to people that you hold that in tension with seeking the truth. Okay? Or vocational respect, but once people transgress that vocation or exceed the authority of that vocation, then we've got to have a way of redressing that. I think I use this example of children parenting, or parents parenting their children differently. And you might see these parents that kind of grow up on Dr. Spock, and they don't believe in discipline, they don't believe in this, their child is a perfect child and they just need to be reasoned with. Well, then you see the child, because they're still little sinners too. They do what's in their own self-interest even at a young age. And you see the child, shooting its carrots across the table, hitting mom and dad in the face. And I always say to people, what shouldn't you do? You shouldn't get up and say, let me explain to you why you need to parent better. We have vocational respect even if we disagree with what we might be seeing there. Now, if the child shoots the food your way and it hits you while you're eating, that may be an opportunity to say, we probably need to have at least a talk so that we can at least agree to disagree, and I'm not affected by the way you parent your kids. So vocational respect, do you understand what I'm saying there? We practice that because God actually civilizes the world through these godly vocations. And so again, Luther's unique thing was he brought back the notion that God was at work in all these vocations. Now, he wasn't at work to save the world in many of these vocations, which is why you can have non-believers actually participating in the civilizing of a society. But they were necessary. I mean, if you obliterate the family, which is happening in our culture, if you obliterate these vocations and basically you just say, do whatever you want and everyone will take care of you because there's no vocational responsibility and respect, you can't have a society. And so vocational respect is a very powerful thing. And Luther brought the joy of vocation back to all kinds of vocations that had been kind of discarded in his time. But at the same time, vocations are defined by what God also defines healthy boundaries, if you will, parameters to some of these things. One of the things that I think is a real issue out there today is if you don't differentiate God's preserving and saving work, you can not only get some bad theology, you can get some tyrannical theology. And I see that happening. Usually people say the Christian right. They actually believe that they're legislating their morality and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I hate to tell you this, but the Christian right, as much as I wish some of the laws that they aspire to would get passed, we don't have a very big voice in our culture today. There's a book by James Davison Hunter that's called The Culture Wars, and then he has another one called To Change the World, James Davison Hunter. And he's a sociologist, and he talks about how even the Christian voice, as big as it might seem in some ways, it has very little influence in our popular culture today because of, the fact that the secular Puritans of our culture, they own the schools, they own the media, they own the government, and a lot of different things. They have much more representation in those places, and those are places where culture is literally transmitted. And so again, when we start to talk about these things, I want Christians to get involved in those things and mix it up, but they need to use sanctified common sense and to differentiate God's way of working in the world. I'll give you an example of what I mean. I was doing some research for this discussion today, and I looked at the 5 ways that the Bible talks about, this left-hand kingdom work of getting involved in cultural issues, and they're commands, okay? And here it is. There's commands to individuals who are Christian, commands to families, commands to businesses, commands to church, and commands to government. And one of the most egregious ways that this is being abused today is to view the government as the ultimate fulfiller of the Bible's commands. So the idea of the government being a benevolencer. First of all, the government is a power organization, and so when the government benevolences, it forcibly takes something from one person and gives it away to another. That's not benevolence. And so the government is never commanded to be a benevolencer. Let me just give you of the Bible verses. Individuals are commanded to take care of the sick, the poor, and the stranger. There are no commands for the family to do that. Mostly the commands of family are relational. Husbands, love, agape love your wives. Wives, honor your husbands. Children, obey your parents. And I talked about that being the trinity of civility upon which you can build your society. There are no commands for businesses to take care of the poor. Commands to businesses are to owners of businesses pay fair wages, workers of businesses give an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, etc., etc. Then again, there are commands for the church to take care of the sick, the poor, and the stranger. And a lot of churches, that's why hospitals, schools, all those things were parochial in nature at the beginning of our country, very often late into the country's founding. And there are no commands for the government to do those kinds of things. The government's commands are very limited: to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Think about that. So when you're starting to apply biblical wisdom, again, differentiate that wisdom according to how God wants that differentiated, and then contend for that. Because I will tell you, the government that takes over the role of the church, what it does is it becomes tyrannical because it's hiding behind benevolence as if it's a benevolent organization, and it is not. April 15th is not offering day, okay? But worse than that, it marginalizes the church. And we're seeing more and more of that, where the government's coming in and saying, no, that's our job. That's our job. And if you don't abide by our way of doing it, you can't do that. See, fighting for religious liberty, that's one of the ways that we can say, no, we have a role to play. I don't know if I want to get into this yet, but let me get into it. You know, one of the ways that I was at a meeting in the White House, and it was a great meeting, and it was about foster care and churches, and how the church can be a tremendous blessing to the at-risk kids that are going on in states all over the country. And the Kentucky governor was there, and so were these pastors from some of these big churches that were dedicating their church to becoming foster care churches. And I thought, man, what a great thing. And so these were churches that said that they wanted to actually be a part of the solution to doing this. Well, it was amazing. They were able to actually incorporate these kids into all kinds of blessings and families that could provide stability for them, even as they were looking for them to be adopted, and all these different things. And the church, the families of the church and the churches itself dedicated themselves to being that way. And the governor said it was one of the best things he had seen in his state. The problem is there are civil liberties people coming in and saying that's an abuse of the separation of church and state, and unless those churches abide by the new Overreach ruling of what a family is, or the sexual orientation laws, or any of those kind of things, they can't participate. And then all those kids can be removed from the care of those churches. Again, that's one of the ways we're fighting for our liberties, is a real blessing for the sake of our churches and communities. So vocational respect, seeking the truth. Honor our leaders. Be people who are civil to one another. Even if we're talking about stepping out and saying we disagree with this, we need to do it in an honorable manner. And the American government experiment was, again, limiting that government to its basic role. Now, the other thing is seeking the truth, keeping the government in check. That's, again, where we need to seek data. We need to seek wisdom, too, for the sake of our own good. Okay? Now, forward. What do we do? Well, again, faith, knowledge. Again, we talked about this last time. Have a plan for your family. Have a plan for your church. Plan for your community. And the question then becomes, what if your government will not allow you to exercise that plan? And that's where fighting for your religious liberty is key. But you're not fighting contentiously. You're fighting to make sure that you have a voice and have a way of serving. And that's what I'm saying. When those churches were doing their foster care service to the community, it was a phenomenal blessing to the state. But then they had to fight for their religious liberty to do that, because they had disagreements about their view of marriage and the view of marriage that was in the culture at large. And those are worthy fights, because those fights lead to healthy service of our neighbor. So if you're out there right now and you're trying to figure out ways to open up, don't just think about ways to open up for the sake of worship. Think about the ways that you open up and you begin to serve your neighbor in a unique way. When we talk about opening up to neighbor, I know right now knocking on a door and saying, how can we help you, is a dangerous thing to do, because people are afraid of what might be on the front step. But there's got to be a way where we can still be of service to our neighborhood using the kind of technology and the things and the opportunities that we have. So be creative there. And if you start to see the government push back on you there, that's actually a religious liberty issue, because you have not only the right, and the protection, you have the responsibility as a church in this culture to be a part of the solution. Now, the other questions, I've tried to incorporate some of these questions throughout, but one of the things that was talked about going forward is what about disagreeing, and what about protesting? What do we do when those kinds of issues come up? And we talked about that last time. Pastor Jordan, I think you sent this one on. We talked about how when you get out there and you start to exercise your citizenship, you just got to be careful that, is this a thus saith the Lord thing, or is this just me exercising my rights? Which one is it? And we talked about the grid of engagement. So look back on that. I think you have a thus saith the Lord with the sanctity of life. I think you have a thus saith the Lord with religious liberty, properly understood as a biblical understanding of how God created human beings to be. But when it comes down to particular policies, you might have a lesser of two evils, a solution that you can vote for, but you might have someone who votes differently, and you still can both hold those things and be faithful to the overall work of the Scripture. So, you might have some people saying, no, we need to stay home now, and they have the capacity to stay home. It doesn't affect their businesses to stay home and those things, and they may make that decision to do that, where you may be saying, no, I think we need to venture out at this point, and you guys might have differing opinions on how to do that going forward. Both of you should be trying to figure out how to do it to be faithful to God and in service to your neighbor, and to try to do it with wisdom and sanctified common sense. So you have these liberties, you have these protections, but so that you can act as free citizens in service to others. So even there, we venture out with a certain amount of Reformation restraint, like we talked about last time. But again, when we talk about this, we should always act with obedience, not disobedience. We should keep this intention, this faithfulness to God, honor of the magistrate, and service to neighbor. Those are always going to be in tension, because we know that our civil politics will not save the world, but they can mitigate some of the worst aspects of our world. The other question that was asked was, should we start what if we start some online campaigns and making our voice known that way? That's good. I think, what would be great, first of all, is to sit down, if you've got church people or other churches, and you see some of these things where you can actually speak with one voice, or have a letter drafted and then send that on. Because when you talk about taking the time to craft a letter of a bunch of constituents and you actually send that on to someone else, that's a powerful, powerful thing. Sometimes I think the internet, for all of its ability to deliver stuff, doesn't always help us, in terms of personalizing it. And politicians, the one thing I've learned in my work on the Hill, politicians, if you take the time to come to visit them, or you take the time to actually bring the voice of several people to their attention, they do listen to that. That's one of the reasons why I'm asking you, if you like what we're doing, please sign on to Word from the Center. Type LCRL 444999, type that in, and join our Monday, Friday devotion and op-ed. Because if we come in and say, well, we've got 10, 15, 50,000, 100,000, people, if we've got that kind of voice, and we represent 2.2 million Christians, we represent 6,000 churches, 2,200 schools, and we come and say, we want to talk to you about educational freedom, or we want to talk to you about the institution of family and what it's doing in our communities, and why we need to learn how to support that, they're going to listen, because they hear your voice sitting in that room with me. So I would say, the first thing you can do is maybe try to get a bunch of people together, put your name on it. We do this a lot. We put our name on letters that are drafted, so that when we deliver them to congressmen or senators or congresswomen, they go, oh, all these people are behind this? And so again, that's the best way to do it. You can do the internet too. I don't disagree with that. And then there's legal ways of protesting and saying, we're here to say no to this. And there's some issues where the church as a whole might need to say no. And I think the abortion debate is our best example of that. And I think we've done a great job of doing that civilly, with care and concern for mother, child, and family. So I hope that helps. I would suggest that again, trying to actually put a voice of committed people, and then start with your local senator, congressman, congresswoman. Start there and let it bubble up. I think that's always the best way to go. Vocational respect, seeking the truth. I hope that helps you. The difference in Romans 13 and speak the truth in love in Paul's day and in our day is that the American experiment flipped Caesar and the citizen upside down. America talks about you as a citizen. The Bible's context is Caesar and subject. And so we have more responsibilities in the American context, and of course more opportunities to be useful to God's civilizing work in the culture. But remember, if you do that civilizing work, you also bless the culture and you open up opportunities to share the gospel. So again, vocational respect, seeking the truth. Let God open us up. Be encouraged. Please be a part of our going forward as we start to expand into other topics on these Wednesday Liberty Alerts. Text LCRL to 444999 and join the team. Be a part of us. Stay informed with our Facebook page. And if you're able, please donate to our cause, because we are in D.C. Serving at the pleasure of God's people. So again, we're in no budget. We're actually there trying to do this work for you because you have partnered with us and sent us on. So God bless you. Gosh, I hope and pray that you're doing well. And I pray for our country. I pray that we begin to open up. And tomorrow is National Day of Prayer. So please take this opportunity to pray for our country. Pray for a return to virtue. Pray for a celebration of liberty where we really cherish it, because liberty is a precious thing. And if we understand the role of liberty, it's so that we might be servants to one another going forward. And that, I think, is going to be the key to a healthy overcoming of this pandemic, and also a healthy opening up of our country. All right, if you would bow your heads if you're so inclined, and let's pray Luther's Prayer. I thank you, my Heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have kept me this night from all harm and danger, and I pray that you would keep all of us this day from sin and every evil, that all our doings in life may please you. For into your hands we commend ourselves, our bodies and souls, and all things. Let your holy angel be with us, that the evil foe may have no power over us. Amen. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.